bottom of the page or start a watch party so that people can be a part of what's going on right now. The social unrest that has come from the horrific death of George Floyd seems to be increasingly calling for the defunding of police. Before I comment on this call, we need to understand a little bit more about how we arrived at this crossroads. I'm not addressing individual police officers. I know some very fine police officers, but I'm addressing the police as an institution. It may be interesting for you to know that the average police officer will never discharge his or her firearm in their entire career outside of the firing range. Unfortunately, we must deal with those who do and those who do so in questionable circumstances. Before law and order became a powerful political theme, the police were not militarized as they are now. In the North, the police were primarily organized and paid to protect merchants and their merchandise. From the 1800s to the 1960s, the police were referred to as peace officers, not police officers. Unfortunately, in the South, the police were organized to preserve the slavery system, and their tasks included chasing down runaway slaves and preventing slave revolts. The movement to professionalize the police seems to have happened in the administration of President Hoover in conjunction with the Wickersham Commission of 1929. But the concept and the phrase law and order became a powerful theme in America in the 1960s. The phrase has been used in politics off and on really since the 1780s, but the phrase was used by Gerald Ford in 1966. The civil rights movement contributed to the social, racial unrest, and the conservatives demanded that the national government should promote respect for law and order and contempt for those who violate it, regardless of the cost. In 1965, Lyndon Baines Johnson called for war on crime. Following that came the congressional approval of the Law Enforcement Assistance Act of 1965 and the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act, directing federal funding to local police. Please forgive me for drastically reducing this history, but it's a long history. Then came the war on drugs. In 1971, President Nixon declared drug abuse public enemy number one and greatly increased military enforcement of drug laws, increased penalties, and incarceration for drug offenders. One result was the imprisoning of millions of African American men on low-level drug charges, mostly having to do with marijuana. You hear me refer to that sometimes as prison fare. Most importantly, in keeping with this particular paper and what I'm talking about tonight, this is where the police were militarized and incentivized to go into the black neighborhoods and conduct warfare. Today, modern police look like soldiers. So what would we expect when they come into our neighborhoods? So what needs to happen? Again, some are calling for the defunding of the police. That is to stop funding and to get rid of police. Some believe that we can police ourselves. Now, when some use that terminology, they really don't mean defund the police, but they mean to redirect funds. Some, from a sociological perspective, at least let me say, I don't believe that people, specifically unsaved, sinful people, can police themselves. The Bible lets us know that the law is for the lawless. Paul wrote in Romans 13, 1 through 17, please allow me to read this for you this evening. Every person is to be in subjection to the governing authorities. For there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God, and they who have opposed will receive condemnation upon themselves. For rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil. Do you want to have no fear of authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. For it is a minister of God to you for good. But if you do what is evil, be afraid, for it does not bear the sword for nothing. For it is a minister of God, an avenger who brings wrath on those who practice, or one who practices evil. Therefore, it is necessary to be in subjection, not only because of wrath, but also for conscience sake. For because of this, you also pay taxes, for rulers are servants of God, devoting themselves to this very thing. Render to all what is due them. Tax to whom tax is due. Custom to whom custom. Fear to whom fear. Honor to whom honor. May the Lord add a blessing to the reading of his holy word. I'm not going to do a teaching on these verses, but they are basically letting us know that we need government, and governments have police, and we need not fear them when we are doing good. However, the Bible also demonstrates that there are times when we must resist governments, when they are infringing upon our God-given rights and our freedoms. The Bible reads in Acts 5:27, and when they had brought them, they stood them before the council. And the high priest questioned them, saying, "We gave you strict orders not to continue teaching in this name. And yet you have filled Jerusalem with your teaching and intend to bring this man's blood upon us." But Peter and the apostles answered, "We must obey God rather than men." Of course, we must obey God rather than men at times when the government is against what God is for. When we choose to nonviolently resist the governing authorities, to draw attention to their injustice, we also choose to voluntarily submit ourselves to their penalties, because we are not advocating lawlessness, but conscientious protests. So we don't want to defund the police, but with 401 years of police brutality, 50 years of the war on drugs, we want police reform. I started to entitle this paper, "Fight the Power," in keeping with Public Enemy's 1980 hit, but I suspected that many people would think that the song was about getting rid of the police. The group's bass player, Brian Hargrove, has said of the song's message that law enforcement is necessary. As a species, we haven't evolved past needing that. Fight the Power is not about fighting authority. It's not that at all. I'm quoting. It's about fighting the abuse of power. That's what we want to do today, to fight the abuse of power. Consequently, please allow me to suggest some areas of police reform. Please remember, I was a part of the Attorney General's Advisory Committee on Law Enforcement Training back in late 2014 and early 2015. This was when Governor DeWine was Attorney General. Our report recommends some of the reform that are now being suggested, plus many others. Please allow me to review some police reform suggestions. Applicants with felony convictions or offenses who are prohibited from carrying a gun should not be permitted to attend a basic training academy. Next, the advisory group recommended that applicants pass a drug screening prior to admission into any police academy. In addition to a drug screening, the advisory group recommended that each applicant undergo a psychological exam to confirm that the applicant has the right psychological makeup to serve as a police officer. The advisory group also recommended that each applicant pass a truth verification test, such as a polygraph test, to assure that their answers are true. The advisory group recommended adding any sex offenses and misdemeanor crimes of violence as disqualifiers for enrolling in a basic training academy. These are all things that have already been recommended. The advisory group recommended classes on implicit bias and procedural justice, that they be required throughout peace officer basic training. Implicit bias training focuses on officers understanding themselves and how their decisions can be affected by their inherent unconscious biases. Procedural justice focus on police interacting and strengthening their bonds with the communities they serve. Enhancing positive community-police relations is a key to building trust between law enforcement and their communities. The advisory committee furthermore suggested mental health training, but perhaps funds right now should be directed from the police and directed towards mental health workers to aid the police. That is an example of the kind of police reform that could be very helpful. That is an example of what's being talked about under the guise sometimes of defund the police. Dontre Hamilton was shot 14 times during an incident that occurred after workers at a nearby Starbucks called police to complain about him sleeping in Milwaukee's Red Arrow Park. Rather than calling the police, perhaps another group that could deal with mental health could have been called and trained and called, and perhaps that would be a way, part of the way of reallocating funds from the police department or within the police department. The advisory group suggested de-escalation training. The police should know how to de-escalate as opposed to escalate situations where violence might be involved. I believe a number of these suggestions were implemented or are in the process of being implemented. Often these kinds of changes are difficult to implement because the Ohio Police Officers Training Academy, at least when I was there doing this research and report, did not have the authority to mandate these changes in the roughly 88 police departments in Ohio. Please allow me to close this particular paper with some additional suggestions that are being called for around the nation. A diverse group of people may be needed to mandate or to review the use of force incidents. When there is a use of force incident, it is a conflict of interest to have the police investigate the police. A diverse group of citizens should be gathered and trained to review those incidents. The police can be a part of that particular group, but it needs to be a diverse group. Ban the use of chokeholds. Not only should chokeholds be banned, but those who use them should then be prosecuted. Because sometimes we are talking right now about banning the use, but there is no penalty when people use them anyway, or when police officers use them anyway. Eliminate no-knock warrants in drug cases. When Breonna Taylor and her boyfriend, Kenneth Walker, woke up on March the 13th to the sound of someone breaking into their Kentucky apartment, they had no idea that it was the police executing a no-knock, unannounced search warrant. So they did exactly what many law-abiding citizens would do. Walker called 911, grabbed his legally owned firearm to defend his home from unknown intruders. Just a few minutes later, a hailstorm of bullets was shot haphazardly through the house or the apartment with cascade, and it was an apartment, and into neighboring apartments as well, in a tragic exchange that left Taylor dead, a police officer wounded, and Walker under arrest. By the way, neither Walker nor Taylor were mentioned in the search warrant. In addition, require body cameras at all times. Body cameras will not solve all problems, but they will give another source of information when the conditions of an incident are disputed. And then create a federal registry of all officers accused of misconduct. This will prevent dismissed officers from going from one police department to another undetected in another part of the state or another part of the country. No, we don't want to defund the police, but the funding that the police receive should be reviewed and should be reassessed. These are some of the things that need to be handled and need to be understood when we discuss defunding the police. Let me add one more thing that you should be aware of, because sometimes the black community is not understanding what's taking place when there is a shooting an incident of force, and then the person gets off and is not prosecuted. There is case law that says that if a police officer feels threatened, he or she can use any amount of force necessary. That needs to be changed, not only from a de jure legal perspective, but in the case law itself, that's going to have to be overturned, so that when people use force, that use of force is reviewed and is not automatically okayed simply because a person says that they felt threatened. I hope tonight that this teaching will help you to understand better what's going on. Because right now, at this unique singular moment, we have an opportunity to make a difference. I'm not sure how long this moment is going to last. I'm not sure how long we're going to be standing at this particular crossroad, but I pray that we will be making these and other changes that have to do with not simply giving us better laws, but ultimately humanizing us and making us and allowing us to be the people that we really are. Black lives really do matter, and we really are worth any human being. Thank you for listening this evening. May God bless you.